One of the first interviews related to biblical archaeology was conducted with Professor Jim Phillips, an anthropologist and archaeologist, and a curator for the Chicago Field Museum. He helped me understand the early efforts of scholars interested in the Bible, Palestine, and the world of ancient Egypt.
Egyptology as a, quote, academic discipline began certainly in the late 19th century, but it was based on the earlier translations of Champignon of the Rosetta Stone, which was found by Napoleon's troops in Egypt near Rosetta in the delta of the Nile. It was a piece that was written in Greek, it was written in hieroglyphs, and Demotic, which is the cursive script of Egyptian pharaonic language. Many of the original Egyptologists were clerics, were specifically clergy people who didn't have parishes actually, but went into academia, were interested in both Egyptian religion and in philology, that is the study of language in the Egyptian language, more specifically in the study of hieroglyphs. There's a basic difference between the clergymen working in Egyptology and the clergymen working in the area of what we today call Mesopotamia or Palestine. The people in Palestine, the clergy people in Palestine and in Mesopotamia were interested actually in the Old Testament and for searching for the real cities, searching for the events that occurred in the Old Testament, that are written down in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, for example, or the book of Exodus or Judges, as opposed to Egyptian clergy people who founded Egyptology, who were much more interested in language and the nature of hieroglyphs. As time went on in the 20th century, Egyptology became divided into two separate entities. One is the archaeological element, that is excavating the sites left by pharaonic civilization, and the other into the language element, the philological element. And even though they may be in the same department, sometimes they don't even speak to one another. The archaeological realm that we're talking about has produced an enormous amount of really fine scholars in a number of institutions across both Europe, North America, and in Egypt today, where they're interested in pharaonic material, not ever necessarily interested in trying to look at the Old Testament, of which of course is the basis of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and trying to read some of the stories in relationship between that mention Egypt and see if there's any reality to those stories. Biblical archaeology today is not involved in Egypt. Never was, isn't today. Biblical archaeologists specifically are people who work in the Near East, that is that part of the Near East that's in Asia as opposed to Africa. Egyptologists have a very different way of looking at life than people working in the Levant, as it were. And because of that, I don't see ever, I have never seen an Egyptian archaeologist interested in the topic of an exodus, or were Semites ever captured and kept as slaves and build the pyramids, or whatever particular stories that we see in the newspapers or we read about in books.
I talked with Egyptologist Martin Raven about this fascination to find a connection between the Bible and the archaeology of the ancient past.
In the old days, part of the fascination for ancient Egypt would come from our religious, our Christian or Jewish traditions, because the Bible talks about the Egyptians. The earliest generation of Egyptologists, they were all preachers of the church, and yes, they had the biblical stories, and they wanted to see for themselves whether there was any truth in that, and that's why they started reading Egyptian texts, etc. Nowadays, archaeology has taken over, the study of language has taken, linguistics has taken over, and we are not so much oriented on religion anymore as in the old days. So, but of course we don't forget that there was this fascination, that there was this link, and it's always nice if you can illustrate things that you know from the Bible, but very, very few things can really be proved by archaeological or linguistic evidence from the other culture, from the Egyptian culture.
You said something that people come to you all the time and asking the same question about Ipuar.
Yeah. Many people come to the museum and ask for the Ipuwer papyrus. And if they say Ipuwer papyrus, I already know that they have heard about these books by Velikovsky, because Egyptologists call it the admonitions. So if you say Ipuwer papyrus, you have read the other books. And then I am prepared that that is their interest, and it's fair enough. They're entitled to their own views, but don't try to convince me that all the Egyptologists have it wrong.
Raven saw no connection with the admonitions of an Egyptian sage and the biblical text. In Washington, D.C., I met with Herschel Shanks, the founder of the Biblical Archaeological Society and the editor for Biblical Archaeology Review. Since many scholars dismiss the Bible as not being historically credible, I asked him if biblical archaeology was considered a credible endeavor.
Is biblical archaeology a credible field? I think there's a divide among professionals. Among some of them, biblical archaeology has a bad name. They don't like it. They think it's non-professional. They think it has a history, which it does, of some scholars trying to use archaeology to prove the Bible, which no archaeologist does today. And then there are others, of whom I'm one, who are very interested in the Bible. And we want to know what illumination we can get about that text from archaeology. Archaeology provides a context. It shows how people lived and what they did and the way they thought, the motives. And from this, it enlightens the text. Now, it doesn't prove or disprove the text very, very often. It's very rare that you find a one-for-one correspondence between archaeology and the Bible. But what we do know from archaeology is that the basic story is a very plausible one. Moses' name is Egyptian. The Egyptian ambiance is actual and corroborated. For example, in Israel, most of the building is of stone. Well, this story is written about making mud bricks, which is what they do in Egypt. And there are many other details which are very plausible. Now, to those who want more from archaeology, especially those who are skeptical, who say, okay, Shanks, you've made a plausible case, but I still doubt. I still disbelieve it as history. There was no Exodus. Then to that person I say, what would you want? Use your imagination. What could prove the Exodus? Nothing. I mean, do you expect to find an old Egyptian account of this? This was probably very unimportant to the Egyptians. I mean, this was some slaves that were escaping. Now, incidentally, the Bible says that there were a couple million people. Now, I don't accept this. That's a fact that is subject to rational inquiry. The Bible says that 600,000 able-bodied men as fighters crossed the desert. And if you add women and children and the mixed multitude that went with them, you get 2 or 3 million. Now, that part of it is myth. If you say, how do you know that's myth? Well, I can't prove that, but that's just the way it impresses me. So you have a relatively small group of people who left Egypt, and it's impossible to imagine what today would demonstrate that. I mean, you might find pottery, but how do you know that it's the Israelites handled this? Some scholars do say that the Exodus is a myth as a whole. And I think they're throwing out the baby with the bath. I think that's a gross exaggeration. It really is an example of a violation of a well-known principle, and that is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There is not something specific enough for them. And I would ask them, what would prove the Exodus? And I think they would be very hard put to answer that. The people who say that the Exodus is a myth don't depend on archaeology very much. What they are really saying is that if you look at this story, it is the kind of legendary account that people construct to explain their origins. And it's because of the genre, not the evidence. There's no evidence that conflicts with the Exodus. But it's legendary, more than mythical, I think. And I would even have an answer to this. We do have a lot of legends or myths, if you wish, about foundations and creations of peoples. But this is the only one that traces our origins back to slaves, not to princes and kings, but to slaves. This gives it a ring of truth. And I'm not ready to throw this out, especially when you realize that the setting, the mise en scène of the story is right, and everything fits its Egyptian background and context. Moses' name is Egyptian. The places, some of them have been found already. Now that doesn't mean that every aspect is historical. You have Moses killing the Egyptian, fleeing. Well, did he actually kill the Egyptian who was beating up on a Hebrew slave? How could you possibly prove yes or no by archaeology? It'd be ridiculous to ask that question. But if I ask them what would prove the Exodus, there's nothing that would satisfy them. I mean, what can you, just use your imagination. So it's an impossible task that they're asking. The Exodus story is a combination of miracles and history. Now, the miracles you can't deal with archaeologically or rationally because they're miracles. Whether the Red Sea parted is a miracle. Whether the 10 plagues happened is a miracle. I mean, you have one of the plagues was darkness, and you had darkness where the Egyptians were, and right beside them in a different area was where the Israelites were, and it was light there. Well, you know, that rationally that may not make sense, but miracles, you can do anything. So you have elements of miracles, and we cannot ask ourselves rationally whether they occurred. Now, you also have historical elements to the story. Were the Israelites in Egypt? Were they enslaved? Did they leave for the land of Canaan, the promised land? Those kind of questions you can ask. And I think a plausible case can be made, not a certain case, that historically this did happen. And I think there's something you can ask about a miracle. If the ancient peoples saw it as a miracle, they regarded it as a miracle, what is it that led them to this? There may be a natural event that led them to determine it as a miracle, to see it as a miracle. And very often, I would say amateur archaeologists are looking for this kind of thing. To me, it really doesn't deepen our understanding. Take the plagues. One of them is that the Nile ran blood. Now, the ancient Israelites may have understood this to be a miracle. They did. And people look for rational physical explanations of this. And they say, well, if you have this certain algae that goes in at this time of the year, then the Nile flows red and it looks like blood. Now that seems a little far-fetched to me, even if there is this algae, because the Bible doesn't say it flowed with red algae, it says it flowed with blood. But even if you say, well, this is how the ancient Israelite historian imagined it, then I think that doesn't deepen the story one whit for me. As a matter of fact, it makes it less attractive because it shows a miracle to be a magic trick. That's not what a miracle is. I think that one of the things that makes the Exodus story plausible is that the Israelites settled in the area of Goshen, which we know about. We know there were Semitic slaves there. We know that people from Canaan went down there in times of drought. Manfred Bietek of Vienna is excavating there at Tel El Daba, and he's confirming much of this. He's a super archaeologist, and what Manfred Bietek says I would take as trustworthy. No archaeologist today, professional archaeologist, is out to prove the Bible. Archaeology doesn't do that. And if you need archaeology to prove the Bible, you have a mighty shallow faith. I think that the pursuit of biblical archaeology is fascinating and wonderful and very insightful. And I accept the definition of the greatest biblical archaeologist who ever lived, William Foxwell Albright, that biblical archaeology spans the centuries from the beginning to practically the modern period, and from England to India, because all of it provides a context in time and space for this miracle document that we have that we call the Bible. And it illuminates it. It sets us in time and place. It's a human document. I don't believe that the Bible was handed down to Moses completely written. As a matter of fact, in its own terms, it was not. It was written using older sources. It was several sources. It was put together by an editor, and you have different people involved. It's very complicated. And we have some of the most inspiring, meaningful matters that are dealt with, that talk about where we came from, philosophically, theologically, historically. So to be in this field of realia, of actual artifacts that tell us and set this in place and time, is a very exciting venture. To say that it's going to prove the truth or falsity of it is another question. And that I don't think archaeologists do or should do. Archaeology cannot prove or disprove the Bible.